All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. And this week I'm going to be back on the Mustang hood skin project. So I got to pull it off the car and get it on a stand, and we'll get to doing that first. All right, so the first thing we need to do is I'm going to take the 70 skin off the top. If you remember right, it's just overlaid on top of the 67, 68 skin. So I'm going to pull all the Clecos out, take that off, and then I'm going to apply some die chem layout fluid. That way we can come back and I can scribe this edge and then trim it. We'll do one side at a time when it comes to cutting, fitting, and welding. So let me get all these Clecos pulled out, and we'll get this skin off, and then we'll get everything prepped and ready for the next steps. All right, so I'm going to apply some die chem layout fluid all around where our panels overlapped and the Cleco holes are. So you can use brush on. This time I'm just going to use aerosol because it's going to be quicker. So I'm going to come in and just where our Cleco holes were, come just on the outside of that. So when we put the panel back on and we scribe it, we should be scribing right through the center of the die chem here. So we'll let that dry for a minute. So while the die chem is drying, I want to talk a little bit about Clecos and kind of how I'm using them on this hood in case you haven't seen any of my other videos about Clecos. So to get the top piece back on the 67 hood skin, and we know it's going to be in the same spot every time, I'm using a series of Clecos. That's where these 1/8" holes are drilled. The Cleco will go inside of that. So the panels are overlapped for now, and there's a pilot hole drilled through the two, and then the Cleco goes through and lines back up those holes, and it holds itself with these barbs. So I'll show you here, it's in the pliers. So this is how a Cleco works. When you squeeze the pliers, the two barbed ends come beyond this center piece, and they get a little tighter so you can fit it in an 1/8" hole, and when you release it, the center comes back through, pushing the barbed ends out, and it grabs the edges of the hole and squeezes it together. So it's always going to go back to the same spot when you put it on and you reuse Clecos. So then you don't have to worry about any misalignment. So as soon as this dries, we'll put the top piece back on, put all our Clecos back in. Making sure to put all of them in right now is critical. That way we get a nice clean line. And then we will scribe where our cut seam is going to be, pull it off, and move forward. All right, we're going to sit the center section of the 70 hood in place, being careful not to scoot it too much because we don't want to scratch the die chem. So I'll come back in and we'll put all our Clecos in. Now with our line scribed, I went ahead and pulled the top piece back off. I'm not sure how well you can see the scribe line from there, but I'll do a close-up shot of it to show how nice and clean the scribe line is on both sides. And then next is going to get the really exciting part. So I'm going to have to come in here and rough cut half the hood off. I'm going to do it one side at a time, that way I don't get too carried away. But I'll cut the center section out, and then I'll come back and I'll trim this out with 10 snips. And what I'm going to do, in case I forget to explain it while I'm trimming it, I'm not going to cut all my Cleco holes off because I need something to realign the pieces. That way they fit right back up where they were before. So I'm going to do pretty much every other Cleco hole I'm going to leave for now. And that'll let me put the panels back together. Then I can tack everything up, and then I can take an air saw and I can come in and trim off the tabs and finish those areas as well. So that's a really good trick to hold everything back together, is don't cut all your Cleco tabs off from the get-go. Leave a couple to realign everything. So like I said, it's going to get real interesting now that I have to cut the hood skin in half, but it all has to get done. All right, got the one side rough cut off, and I'm going to come back in with 10 snips by hand, and I'm going to trim on this line. Again, I'm going to leave a couple tabs here just to catch for when I Cleco it back together, and we'll cut those off later. Now that everything is trimmed, I went around the edge with our large Vixen file. I filed everything, make sure we didn't have any weird waves, and came back hammered and dollied where the Cleco tabs are, where our cut started and stopped. Gets a little deformed there, so I tidied that up, and now I can go back to the stand and put the center section on top of this, and we'll re-Cleco it. I'll clean off the die chem where I'm going to weld, and we'll start tacking the two pieces together and kind of continue on with that process. It's going to be a little bit of a long, drawn-out process. We're going to tack everything, hammer and dolly it out, and then once I'm happy with that, we're going to go ahead and weld everything. So that's a pretty long weld seam. So it'll take me a little bit because I'm going to do it in as few starts and stops as I can, but again, it's still a pretty decently long seam, so it'll take a little bit to get it all welded up. All right, so now I'm putting the side we just trimmed back on. It goes under the upper piece, and I'm gonna line up the remaining Cleco tabs here that I left. Get everything kind of fit back up. See, and this is why leaving a few tabs here and there to help hold everything is a good idea. If not, we'd be kind of fighting, trying to get everything to line back up. So there it's all clamped back together for now. I'm going to go ahead and clean the die kim off where I'm going to be welding, get the welder all set up, and we'll start tacking it up. We're pretty much set up and ready to start tacking this side of the two hood skins together that I already trimmed and filed. Got the die kim all cleaned off and got the welder set up. So we're going to use the Miller 250, and I have a 1/16 tungsten in here that I've sharpened. We're going to be using 030 filler rod. Instead of the standard 16th inch, I like the really small filler rod on sheet metal. And then I've got the welder set up for electrode negative, and then I've got it set at 50 amps. The best rule of thumb is 1 amp for every 1/1000th of an inch of material. So this is right around 19 gauge, 20 gauge-ish. So it's 35 to 47 thousandths depending on your mill. So I just went ahead and set it at 50, so we got a couple extra amps to play with. So I'm going to start at the back edge, and I'm going to clamp it here to get everything nice and flush. And I'm going to put a couple tacks, and then I'm going to come in and pull this Cleco off, and I'm going to use our air saw to come in and cut that Cleco tab off and work my way forward. When I do sheet metal panels like this, I like to start at one end and work my way to the other. I don't come in and tack it in a handful of spots and then come back and try to tack in between. You might get some weird distortion. It's better to work from one end to the other and make sure everything stays nice and tight throughout the seam as you move forward and get everything all dialed in. So I'm going to start tacking everything up, get everything going, and hopefully here soon we'll have everything tacked up and ready to weld solid. All right, the seam's all tacked up from the back to the front, and I hammered things out as I went along. That way I could get the panels, when the welding introduced heat to it, they would move a little bit. So I'd do a couple tacks, come back in, hammer and dolly it, get it close to close the seam back up and work my way around. So before I weld the panel solid, I'm going to come back, spend some more time hammering and dollying, getting everything a lot smoother, and I'll clean the seam with a wire brush, top side and bottom side. So I've got our dollies and our hammer here. I'll do that. And one thing I wanted to talk about, when you use an air saw to cut back through the little tabs you left for your Clecos, you can see in the video I'm not holding it straight down. I'm kind of coming in at a 45-degree angle, give or take. And the reason I do that is because if I get a little bit off and I do it at a 45, the panels will both be 45, and as they come together, it'll still be a nice tight gap. You don't have to worry as much about the thickness of your blade giving you too much of a gap between your panels if you hold your air saw blade or your cutoff wheel at about a 45-degree angle. So I wanted to give you that little tip, especially if you were wondering why I was holding the saw at that angle. So like I said, I'm gonna come back, I'm gonna hammer and dolly this, clean it up a little bit more, and then I'll start the welding process, and we'll get it all welded solid. And I weld my stuff a little different than some people out there. I don't do a bunch of little stitches. Once I get everything prepped, I'll start at one end, and I will work as far as I can in one shot, so as few starts and stops as possible. I do that because anytime you introduce heat to a panel, it's going to expand, the molecules are going to move around, and as it cools, that's what gives you the warpage, is the contraction of the weld. So my thought is if you have a bunch of little stitch welds, you're going to get hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, and your panel is going to mimic that with a bunch of warps. Or if you do one long continuous weld, or as few starts and stops as you can, you get hot, cold. So even heating is going to be even cooling. Some people don't agree with it, but you have to find what works best for you. And that's only on oxy fuel or TIG welding. MIG welding is a whole different thing, and I personally don't like MIG welding on sheet metal, so I'm not really going to talk about that at this point. But when I TIG weld all my sheet metal, I like to do it in as few starts and stops as possible. So let me get this dollied up and we'll get to welding.